Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to request Mr. Saran Chakyani to do the lecture on the applications, principle of evidence and procedure as applicable to arbitration in India. Saran sir can start the lecture.
Right. Hi. Good afternoon, Siddharth, Neeraj.
Yes,
Thank you for having me on this web or digital platform. I was requested to do a few lectures on arbitration so that we could try and use our time constructively. Neeraj, can I just request you to ask everyone to mute themselves because
Yes, sir.
I'm still getting some audio feed.
Yes, sir. I will request to everyone, please mute the everyone so that Saran sir can speak on the lecture.
Just tell me whether I can start, Neeraj. Tell me whether I can go ahead.
Yes, sir. You can. Yes, sir.
Right. So first, Neeraj, as I was saying, thanks to Siddharth and you for putting this digital or
Sir, I think you're on mute.
sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Sorry, I lost you for a second. I said that I just wanted to thank Siddharth and Neeraj for the opportunity to speak on a subject which we all use or employ on a regular basis as part of our civil and commercial law practice. And it was in the idea was to try and speak on something that is relevant and which will perhaps become more relevant now because whilst the full-fledged functioning of courts is something that is uncertain in terms of when it will happen. Of course, it will happen, but we don't know when it will happen. I personally believe that it's a matter of time before arbitrations will resume using virtual and electronic platforms like these. So perhaps for the next few months, we will see an increase in the amount of work that we do as in by way of arbitrations as opposed to court work or conventional court litigation. Therefore, keeping the relevance of this aspect or of this topic in mind, I was asked to do a couple of lectures on the subject of arbitration. And today, the first part that will be addressed in today's webinar is on the principles of evidence and procedure as applicable to arbitrations in India. Now, let me go straight to the topic at hand and say that with the assistance of some of my juniors, there is a paper which has been put together for the purposes of today's webinar. And I had requested Siddharth and Neeraj to email it to all the participants and all the lawyers who are registered with their platform. I think is Lawyers International, if I'm not mistaken.
The Law Club.
I do believe the Law Club. So I do believe that all of you or most of you would have the benefit of a paper which has been done by a few of my juniors and myself. And that paper is on today's subject, and it's a very detailed paper. So if you've not had a chance to look at it, of course, at your own convenience, you can look at the paper because it sets out some of the important principles relevant to the issues of evidence and procedure and arbitrations. But let me therefore go straight to the topic at hand and speak for about 20 to 25 minutes and then throw it open to a few questions. And I think that when we consider the issue of evidence and procedure as applicable to arbitrations, I think that the first question that we have to ask ourselves is that why is it so important? And why is it that it is necessary to revisit the subject of evidence and the subject of procedure, which are part of codified law going back over 100 years? Why was it necessary to revisit evidence and procedure? You have an Evidence Act which goes back into the 19th century. You have the CPC, which is 1908. And there are umpteen number of cases and decided judgments on so many different aspects of evidence and procedure. Why couldn't we simply have followed that model in arbitrations? Why is there a need for a departure? And I think that the question, in a sense, answers itself. And the reason why there is a need for a departure is because arbitrations were conceived of as an alternative to the long process of civil litigation that we see in our courts. And that's something which I don't need to speak about. All of you are experienced in the cumbersome process of litigation. And the reason why civil litigation is long and cumbersome is there are multiple reasons, and I've touched upon those reasons in my paper. If you have my paper, you can look at the initial paragraphs of my paper from paragraphs 4 to 17, where I've given some statistics of the number of new litigations that are being filed every year in court, coupled with the inadequacy of judges to deal with those litigations. That's one part of the problem. One part of the problem is that we don't have the infrastructure, we don't have the human resources to deal with litigation quickly. The other part of the problem is that the Evidence Act and the CPC were statutes that were designed or framed at a point of time when the burden in courts was much less than what they are right now. Perhaps at the turn of the 20th century, in the early 1900s, with litigation being as few as it was practical and viable for the procedures to be as detailed and as elaborate as they were. But today, those detailed procedures are a drag force because that's what slows down the speed of litigation. And it is precisely for that reason that arbitrations were introduced as an alternative to litigation. And when they were introduced as an alternative to litigation, arbitrations were done so with the objective of making decision-making quicker, easier, and faster. Now, in the 1940 Act, let me go straight to the provisions of the Arbitration Act in the 1996 Act. But to understand that, let's understand what the 1940 Act said. The 1940 Act was the precursor to the 1996 Act, as you all know. The 1940 Act essentially contained the same concept or principle of party autonomy. Party autonomy means that if arbitrations are a contract, and they are a contract, then many of the rules that govern arbitrations will be decided by the parties themselves. That is party autonomy. But the 1940 Act said that there are certain principles which will apply to arbitrations which you cannot contract out of or which you cannot derogate from. So, for example, the 1940 Act says in section 41 that the CPC applies to court proceedings. Now, that's interesting. Why would you apply CPC to the court proceedings under the 1940 Act when there is no clear provision on whether it applies to arbitrations itself? And I think that the answer to that question under the 1940 Act is that under the 1940 Act, there was a much greater dependency on courts for the arbitration process itself. So, for example, under the 1940 Act, under section 34 of the 1940 Act, read with section 20 of the 1940 Act, when the arbitrator completed an arbitration, there was a duty upon the arbitrator to file the award in court, and that award will then go through a process of scrutiny by the court before it becomes final and binding on the parties. Now, many of those provisions have been done away with under the 1996 Act. Under the 1996 Act, an award is deemed to be a decree of the court and is executable as a decree of the court. So the role of the court under the 1996 Act is much less. And the 1996 Act under section 5 says that judicial intervention will be contemplated only where it is expressly allowed for. Therefore, under the 1996 Act, unlike the 1940 Act, the emphasis is much more on the arbitration process itself as opposed to this interdependence between court and arbitration. And because the interdependence is less under the 1996 Act, there was a need to introduce provisions in the Act which govern or which allow the tribunal to govern its own making of rules and procedure. And that provision under the 1996 Act, which allows first, of course, the parties and then the tribunal to govern its own rules of procedure and appreciation of evidence, is Section 19 of the 1996 Act. Therefore, my colleagues who are listening today, if I was to identify a single provision, and I'm not suggesting that there is only one provision, but if I was to identify perhaps the most important provision which is relevant to today's topic, it would of course have to be Section 19, because Section 19 essentially says, and I'm not going to read it out, but it's been quoted in the paper, it's been set out in the paper which has been circulated in paragraph 33 of my paper. Section 19 essentially says that in an arbitration, when it comes to procedure and when it comes to evidence, in the first instance, it is for the parties to decide what procedure and what evidence will apply to the arbitration. Now, as a practical matter, and this is 19.1, 19.2, but specifically 19.1, as a practical matter, in most of the arbitration agreements that I have seen, that is in the domestic arbitration agreements, I'm not talking about international arbitration agreements or agreements between multinationals and Indians, because there is a much greater tendency towards institutional arbitration. And when we have institutional arbitration or the applicability of certain institutional rules of arbitration, along with that, you have an identified body of rules of evidence, which is usually the IBA rules of evidence. So that's what happens mostly in international arbitrations. But in domestic arbitrations, or what we sometimes call ad hoc arbitrations, parties seldom, if ever, provide for pre-decided rules of procedure and evidence. Now, in the absence of parties pre-deciding rules of procedure and evidence, the Arbitration Act says that the rules that will apply to an arbitration are rules that will be decided by the arbitrator. The Arbitration Act also says, and I think everyone will be familiar with this, that the principles, that the provisions of the CPC and the Evidence Act do not apply to arbitrations. So there is a clear express provision which says that CPC and evidence does not apply to arbitration. And the last of the elements of Section 19, which I must emphasize, is that what the provision in the Act says is that ultimately it is for the arbitrator to decide all matters in accordance with the principles of natural justice and by giving both sides equal opportunity to represent themselves and to present their case. That's a paraphrase of the language. So you have three parts of Section 19, and I always believe that when in doubt, let's go back to the bare Act. It starts by saying party autonomy, parties may choose. It then says if parties don't choose, the arbitrator may decide on what will be the applicable rules. It also says that the arbitrator is not bound by, and you will note the language. The language is the arbitrator is not bound by the provisions of the CPC and the Evidence Act, but what he is bound by is by the principles of natural justice and equal opportunity to present his case. Now, when you look at the structure of Section 19 and you break it down in this manner, and without getting for a moment distracted by case law, which is important, but we'll come to that in a moment. But if you look at the structure of Section 19, it already gives you an indication of what is the clear legislative mandate on aspects of evidence and procedure as applicable to arbitrations. The answer can be found to a large extent in Section 19. Now, what are the problems that emerged when we looked at the bare Act or the bare language, and what have been the important judgments on this aspect of procedure and evidence? Well, the problems that emerged are this. Number one, that what do you mean by the phrase an arbitrator is not bound by the CPC and the Evidence Act? Does it mean that the arbitrators can decide, to use the Latin expression, ex debito justice, which means that they can decide almost in a panchayati manner. Two people go sit under a banyan tree. The arbitrator does not apply any known principle of law to decide the case, and simply in his heart feels one party is right, one party is wrong, and this is my award. The answer is obviously no, because arbitrations, whilst they're a relaxation of the strict procedures that apply to court, surely they weren't meant to result in arbitrary decision making. Also, one more thing to keep in mind, which is that while Section 19 confers this liberty upon arbitrators, we also have to recall that Section 28 of the Arbitration Act says that the arbitrator must decide in accordance with the substantive law of India. Now, that is a must decide. That is a mandatory provision. An arbitrator cannot decide other than in accordance with the substantive law of India. So here you have a situation where Section 19 gives freedom to the parties and freedom to the arbitrators, but we need to find what are the limits of that freedom. Section 28 says, but the freedom cannot extend to ignoring substantive law. Now, what is interesting is that whilst we call evidence and the CPC, whilst we broadly categorize them as statutes which deal with procedure, they don't entirely deal with procedure. There are principles within the Evidence Act and the CPC which partake of a substantive character, because those principles are so fundamental and so salient in any decision-making process, even in a slightly less formal decision-making process, that those salutary principles perhaps fall within the umbrella of substantive law of India. So, for example, the question that I ask myself is, would it be necessary to decide a list or a dispute by reference to evidence, or can you completely disregard evidence, shut your eyes to it and say, I have complete power under Section 19, I'm going to decide it with no reference to evidence at all? How far does 19 go? I'm giving you an extreme and perhaps an absurd example, but the reason I'm giving you this example is because I want to highlight the tension between an extreme reading of Section 19 and Section 28, which mandates that substantive principles of law will apply. This tension between 19 and 28 has to be reconciled, and that has been reconciled to a degree by judgments of the Bombay High Court. And I will give you two of the judgments that come to mind, which have been highlighted in my paper. The first is a judgment of Justice Mohta, referred to in paragraph 31 of my paper, in the case of Sahyadri Earth Movers, where Justice Mohta, when dealing with the process to be followed in arbitrations, has highlighted three things which are relevant to today's subject. Number one, he says that the Arbitration Act mandates equal and fair treatment. Number two, he says that Section 19 of the Arbitration Act, of course, says CPC doesn't apply and Evidence Act does not apply. But Section 19 also does say, and this is important, that ultimately it is for the arbitrator to determine the admissibility, relevance, materiality, and weight of the evidence that is before him in the course of arbitration proceedings. So obviously the arbitrator is concerned with the process of admissibility, relevance, materiality, and weight. In deciding whether a particular piece of evidence is admissible or inadmissible, he may not be bound by the strict and technical rules, in the sense that an arbitrator may not apply the same technical standard that a judge would apply in whether the language in your affidavit of evidence is sufficient to prove a document for the purposes of the document being read in evidence. He may not. Like, for example, let me give you a practical example, because we are practitioners. We all know that today when you file an affidavit of evidence in court to prove a document, one of the standard sentences that we include in every affidavit of evidence is that the contents of this document are true and correct. Now, that's a mantra. when the witness is stepping into the box or filing as evidence, if that sentence is not there, many judges will say that your witness has not deposed to the truth of the contents or the correctness of the contents. I am not going to mark it. Now, some arbitrators may take the view that yes, I am going to apply this technical standard. But Section 19, when put into practice, means they are not bound by the Evidence Act. If the arbitrator, on reading the evidence as a whole, comes to the conclusion that the witness is deposing from personal knowledge, and therefore I don't need this formal mantra language, I am content if the affidavit of the witness speaks to a document, and I am going to therefore assume that it is to his personal knowledge. That flexibility, that latitude is given to an arbitrator under Section 19. Therefore, that is a practical example of what Section 19 means when it says that an arbitrator will decide or will have the power to decide on the admissibility, relevance, materiality, and the weight of a document. Justice Mohta also says that under Section 19, the arbitrator must analyze the evidence on record. Now, again, that's important. Section 19 is not a holiday completely from the Evidence Act at all, or from the decision-making process, which depends upon appreciation of evidence. There's no holiday from it at all. But it's the arbitrator's job to do that analysis, and I'll come to it in a few minutes, on what the Section 34 standard is when an award is challenged for want of proper appreciation of evidence. That's a separate subtopic. And what Justice Mohta also says is that natural justice, fair play, and equity principles will apply. Now, there is another important judgment which explains the scope of Section 19, and that is the judgment of Justice Dhanuka in Rashmi Housing, which, my friends, you will find in paragraph 35 of my paper. Now, Rashmi Housing is an interesting judgment from a legal and jurisprudential standpoint. Because what I believe it's Justice Dhanuka and Rashmi Housing said, is that the principles of evidence and procedure that apply to arbitrations are akin to the same principles that would apply to another summary tribunal, namely the tribunal set up under the Industrial Disputes Act. And therefore, Rashmi Housing, which is a judgment under the Arbitration Act, said that the evidence and procedural questions or aspects will be those as decided by the Supreme Court in Bareilly Housing. Bareilly Housing was a case where the same issue of principles and evidence and procedure, but vis-a-vis the industrial courts, arose before the Supreme Court. And what the Supreme Court concluded, and that ratio is now applicable to arbitrations, is that whilst the principles, the strict rules are not applicable, paragraph 55 of Rashmi Housing says that the principles of the Evidence Act and the CPC Act, the principles, that is the fundamental principles, are applicable even to arbitration proceedings. Now that takes us to another question, which is, what is a fundamental principle? And that's not an easy question to answer. And sometimes I feel that it's dangerous for judgments and for us as practitioners or people who are participating in lectures to try and ever give you an exhaustive list of what is a fundamental principle of evidence or procedure. And in my time at the bar practicing, I will tell you this, that there is, even as between judges who hear arbitration matters, there is a certain degree of subjectivity of what is fundamental and what is not fundamental. And I often feel, and this is my view as a practitioner, that many times the decision-making process of a judge is to first see whether he wants to uphold an award or whether he wants to interfere with an award. And once the judge makes that broad assessment of how I am going to rule on this matter, then there is almost a process of reverse engineering. And when there is that process of reverse engineering, he will then decide whether the arbitrator's approach ignores a fundamental principle or does not ignore a fundamental principle. But let's try and give you some black and white examples of fundamental principle and not fundamental principles. Okay. Now, here are some of the examples that I would give to you. One thing is very clear, and this we've learned from judgments such as Sangyong and thereafter, that in appreciating evidence, which is part of an arbitrator's role under Section 19, if you can persuade an arbitrator that a particular piece of evidence is vital, that is, it would, by its existence, prove or disprove a fact, an issue, or a relevant fact. And those are terms which are defined in the Evidence Act. What they mean is perhaps a subject for another day because it's an exhaustive subject on its own. If you can demonstrate summarily, quickly, that there is an important document which has been ignored by the tribunal altogether, then ignoring a document, not considering its materiality, not considering its relevance, is perhaps an error which goes to not applying foundational or fundamental principles of evidence to an arbitration proceeding. That's one. Other examples of fundamental principles of evidence in CPC, which according to me would apply even to arbitrations, are the most salutary of rules. So for example, the judgment of the Bombay High Court in paragraph 36 of my paper, which is in Jagmohan Singh Gujral, seems to indicate that the hearsay rule is also a fundamental principle. And if an award is based on hearsay evidence, which means that the critical conclusions in an award are not based on any document, are not based on oral evidence or direct testimony of a witness who is deposing, but the evidence which would otherwise have been excluded as being barred by the hearsay rule, if that is the entirety of what an award is based on, namely hearsay evidence, then I suspect that that approach by an arbitrator would fall foul of fundamental principles of evidence. Again, what about proof of documents? Could you, for example, and I think that this is a slightly more vexed question, but I will attempt to answer it. In commercial arbitrations, again, I find that a large number of decisions are based on documents and less on oral evidence. I'm not for a moment suggesting that oral evidence is not important. Oral evidence is important and extremely important. Please don't think that I'm undermining it, but in commercial arbitrations, documents are of course important because contracts, correspondence, post-contracts, whether letters have been received, whether letters have been replied to, at a practical level, these constitute important components of a decision-making process. Now, suppose a party says that I made this communication to the other side, and this is a critical communication because by this communication, I supplied to them the know-how or the information that would help them resolve the problem with the goods that they've purchased from me during the period of warranty. So there's a dispute about whether there is a breach of warranty or not. And the entire arbitration boils down to whether the supplier of goods has in fact acted under the warranty and resolved the problem. Everything turns on whether that communication has been delivered or not been delivered to the other side. But there is no evidence which has been led as to whether there is receipt of that communication by the other side. Now, I don't think that it involves much of a debate, but suppose the arbitrator does not get into this question at all and simply makes an assumption that the service provider has duly acted in discharging his obligations under the warranty. Would that process of decision-making fall foul of basic principles of evidence? I think that the answer would have to be yes, it would. Because unless the arbitrator is, number one, satisfied, and number two, is able to demonstrate his satisfaction with reference to the evidence on record, how do you reach a conclusion? So these are, my friends, some examples of what constitute, in my opinion, fundamental principles of evidence. And of course, there are many more. Let me then give you examples of what may not fall within the strict rules of evidence and where arbitrators would have more latitude than a court would have. The examples that come to mind readily, my friends, are, we all know that sometimes we struggle in courts when we're proving documents in court before a judge in the High Court. Where we struggle sometimes is when we don't have the original. Original is not in our custody. We cannot locate it, and that's natural because many times there are many, many years that intervene between the actual dispute and the time when we have to lead evidence. And we struggle. Of course, the Evidence Act gives you an answer. The answer is to be found in secondary evidence, which is 63 and 65 of the Evidence Act, 62 and 65 of the Evidence Act, in leading secondary evidence. But the Evidence Act also is quite detailed as to how you have to lay the foundation for secondary evidence. Now, again, there I find that there is subjectivity between courts themselves as to how detailed that foundation has to be. But when it comes to arbitrations, I believe that the strict and technical rules on what are the processes for the purposes of leading secondary evidence can potentially be relaxed by an arbitrator by taking advantage of the flexibility given to him under Section 19 of the Arbitration Act. That is therefore, my friends, one example of where arbitrators can be more efficient and more practical in approaching aspects of evidence and procedure in the conduct of arbitrations. Another example that I would give you is this. So, very interesting example, and this is followed commonly in international arbitrations. I don't see why it should not be followed in domestic arbitrations. In a lawsuit or in a suit, of course, it would depend upon whom the burden lies, and there is the burden in respect of the case as a whole. The burden of the case as a whole is always on the plaintiff, but the burden in respect of specific issues would depend upon who the onus to prove that issue lies. But I don't want to get sidetracked in the much larger question of burden. But I'm only giving this as a prelude to my next example on where arbitrators can take advantage of Section 19, which is this, that in a suit which is filed in the courts, the plaintiff would have to lead all of his evidence in respect of at least those issues where the burden is upon him in the first instance. And under Order 18, even when the burden is on the other side, the plaintiff is given the option to lead evidence first, but subject to a right of rebuttal. So Order 18 of the CPC tells us how evidence has to be led. In arbitrations, what is often followed as a complete departure, and I think a very helpful departure, is this, that in many commercial disputes, a dispute is broken up into two stages, which is liability and quantum. If I'm suing my counter-contracting party for damages, for breach of contract, or a claim under a contract, I must first establish liability under the contract itself, which is, has there been a breach? Oftentimes what arbitrators do is that they take advantage of Section 19 and they break up an arbitration proceeding into two distinct components. You will first have pleadings and evidence purely on the question of liability. There will be a partial award on liability, which is that the arbitrator is going to conclude in the first instance, has there or has there not been a breach of contract? And if the arbitrator concludes that there has been a breach of contract, there is then an entirely distinct round in the proceedings, which is on quantum or damages. Now, that kind of bifurcation between liability and damages by itself under the present CPC and the Evidence Act would not be permissible, because they're both two limbs of a single litigation or a single case. But you can imagine the amount of time that's lost. Now, the downside of breaking it up and perhaps taking a more lenient approach is this, that suppose an arbitrator comes to the conclusion that the claimant has failed to establish breach of contract and nothing left to decide. The hearing gets over. He has not decided the question of quantum or of damages under Section 19 because he is already held that there is no breach. Party challenges the award under Section 34. The Section 34 court is limited because suppose it disagrees with the arbitrator. Suppose it holds that the arbitrator has wrongly held that there has been no breach. The Section 34 court therefore does not get into the question of damages at all because it cannot. There is no ruling on damages before it. And it means that the whole arbitration process has to start again. I mean, of course, it begs the question as to whether it could be referred back to the arbitrator in the first instance also, but there are some provisions of the Act which would have allowed for it. But when you have an incomplete award on only one limb of the dispute, the 34 court's hands are tied. But let's not digress into all of that. The point still remains that under Section 19, there are important departures the arbitrator can make from the provisions of the CPC and the Evidence Act, and this is one of them. A partial award first only on liability, and then a final award on damages if the need so arises. My friends, now the last couple of parts of this lecture which I wanted to spend time on is therefore what then happens at the Section 34 stage. What is the law under Section 34 when it comes to appreciation of evidence, reappreciation of evidence, findings of fact, and how do Section 34 courts approach this? There has been a lot of divergence at least at a practical level. The leading judgments of the Supreme Court seem to speak in the same voice. But again, as a practitioner, as a counsel, I find that how they're applied varies from court to court. But let me tell you this, my friends, that perhaps the highest amount of certainty that I have seen in Section 34 proceedings across different courts, across different judges. And this is something which is a point that I was discussing with my father, also a senior counsel, Haresh Jagtiani. And he made the point to me that perhaps a good suggestion as a practitioner is to always get the arbitrator to decide a case on clear findings of fact. Because if you can sustain, or if you can obtain an award, not sustain, but obtain an award on a clear finding of fact, which is apparent from the record, then the chance to interfere under Section 34 is very limited. Let me very quickly highlight the 3 or 4 judgments which I think we should all be familiar with as arbitration law practitioners, relevant to 34 and the scope of interference under 34. Associate Builders, which says that in domestic arbitrations, and that was before the 2015 amendment, in domestic arbitrations on aspects of fact, the courts would interfere only if we could show that the award was perverse. And perversity was or requires us to be able to demonstrate that the award was based on no evidence at all, or it was based, or a decision based or arrived at by ignoring a vital piece of evidence. That was Associate Builders. Then we had Western Gecko. Western Gecko spoke about arbitrators following what was known as a judicious approach, an approach that would be followed by a fair-minded person. And Western Gecko brought in the public law test of Wednesbury reasonableness into the realm of arbitration. And it says that if any reasonable person would be able to reach that decision based on the material before it, then the courts should not interfere. And Western Gecko also reiterates the same standard, that if there is a finding based on some evidence, then courts should not interfere. The master of the evidence is the arbitrator. The courts will not second guess an arbitrator on findings of evidence or on the appreciation of evidence. Then we had the 2015 amendment, to the Arbitration Act. And as a consequence of the 2015 amendment to the Arbitration Act, there were one or two important changes, which is this, that now the Act, that is the language of the Act, says that a domestic award, which is between two Indian parties seated in India, of course, is capable of being challenged on the ground of patent illegality. And patent illegality, of course, includes perversity, and it includes a finding based upon no evidence at all or by ignoring a vital piece of evidence. And it applies in that sense even the Wednesbury reasonableness test to patent illegality, which is that even if courts do not want to get too distracted by the granular details of findings, but they simply believe that it was not possible for an arbitrator to reach that conclusion, a more holistic approach to an award, the courts can then interfere. But that's under the patent illegality standard. Now, one important change is that the patent illegality standard does not apply to international commercial arbitrations. Now, let me clear something right here and now. International commercial arbitrations are not the same thing as Part 2 arbitrations, namely foreign seated arbitrations. International commercial arbitrations, it's a defined term under the Arbitration Act. It would very much include even arbitrations which are seated in India, which are Part 1 arbitrations, but where one of the parties is a foreign national or the subject matter of the arbitration is located outside India, etc., etc. It's a defined term under the Arbitration Act. I think it's 2F if I'm not mistaken. So when it comes to international commercial arbitrations, and that constitutes a large body of arbitrations because a lot of the multinational disputes, foreign investor disputes, etc., fall within this expression. My friends, please keep in mind that patent illegality is not the applicable standard to challenge an award rendered in an international commercial arbitration. So therefore, the position has now been clarified by the Supreme Court judgment in SsangYong of Justice Nariman, where Justice Nariman has made it clear that if it is an international commercial arbitration, you are restricted to one and one ground of challenge only. And I'm not talking about the earlier challenges, which is violation of natural justice. There, of course, those continue to apply, but I'm talking about in terms of the award itself. The challenge that you are confined to is that the award is in contravention of the fundamental policy of the law of India. Now, what is interesting, my friends, is that this expression, fundamental policy of the law of India, which applies to international commercial arbitrations, has been explained. And Justice Nariman has said that it is a higher standard than the perversity or the patent illegality standard. That the principles of Wednesbury reasonableness, which are a subset of the perversity standard, do not apply to fundamental policy of the law of India. They don't apply to fundamental policy of the law of India. And therefore, when it comes to international commercial arbitrations, the Section 34 court cannot go near any factual or evidentiary decision making at all. Now, it does set the bar very, very high, and some might say that what if an arbitrator has made a fundamental and egregious error on evidence? What if he has looked at documents which are completely inadmissible from the get-go? It's a tough value choice to make. And the value choice that the legislature seems to have made is that if the choice is between some very, very bad decisions which have to be sustained, or upholding the very purpose and efficacy of arbitrations as an institution, giving them meaning, making India an attractive arbitration center because foreign nationals will no longer be worried about how trigger happy our courts are. You have a choice, and everyone is not going to be happy. But to my mind, if you read the judgment of SsangYong, it seems to indicate that if natural justice is followed and if there is fair play and equal opportunity to the parties, then the courts will not get into aspects of procedure and evidence at all under the head of fundamental policy of the law of India. They will not do that. Now, SsangYong was an interesting case where, whilst it lays down the law and the standard at a very high level for fundamental policy of India, the interesting thing about SsangYong is the Supreme Court actually interfered with the award. But it was driven to interfere with the award because one part of the award in that case was based on a document that was taken on record behind the back of the other party. So it violated that golden principle of natural justice. And really, that's where it all comes down to. If you are going to be able to challenge an award under the fundamental policy of India standard, then your best bet is in trying to show that the violation on the part of the tribunal or the departure on the part of the tribunal hits the mark of natural justice, and nothing short of that is perhaps going to be entertained under Section 34. Now, all of this, my friends, has been considered by a judgment of Justice Patel, referred to in paragraph 40 of my note. It's in the case of Union of India versus Recon. It considers all of these judgments. It considers an even more recent judgment, which I had occasion to place before Justice Patel in another matter, which is part heard, in the case of Vijay Kalra. That also explains very clearly the principles of patent illegality versus fundamental policy. Now, why is all of this relevant to what we are actually discussing, which is evidence and procedure? And the reason why it is relevant, my friends, is this, that when you know what courts are likely to do at the Section 34 stage, or what they're likely not to do at the Section 34 stage, it will help you strategize what we should be doing at the stage before the arbitrator. You should know what to insist upon. You should know what to let go. You should know what points of yours are worth your time, what points of yours are not worth your time, because no Section 34 court is going to look at them in any case. That is where you are going to prioritize your arbitration and litigation strategies based on if the arbitrator is in your favor, equip him with everything that he needs to write an award which will not be interfered with under Section 34. If the arbitrator is hostile to you, make sure that at the arbitration stage, you lay the foundation for points that you can argue at the Section 34 stage. But unless you keep both of these two stages in mind at the same time, you will not be able to effectively argue your matter at the arbitration stage. It's about looking ahead and anticipating what the next round holds in store. So this is, as much as I think time permits, I will only mention one more thing, that in my note at paragraph, if I'm not mistaken, page 28, subheading E, I have set out a detailed practitioner's milestone chart or timeline, if you like. And this is really not, not rocket science, for want of a better word. Most of us who've gone through arbitrations have gone through these stages, but I just thought that we're all at different stages of our practice. And sometimes it's nice to have a checklist in front of you. I've done this both from a practitioner's point of view, as also from an arbitrator's point of view. Sometimes we act as arbitrators, and it's good to have a checklist in front of us. Sometimes we're practitioners or counsel engaged in arbitration. So I've put down about 10 or 12 important stages or milestones in an arbitration, starting with the invocation of arbitration under Section 21, appointment of a tribunal, etc., etc. What are the important stages? Some tips based on my own experiences in arbitrations, international and domestic arbitrations, which I've found helpful. And you can, of course, look at that in your own time. And my note then also discusses other important sections of the Arbitration Act which speak to procedure, such as Section 23, Section 24, which is the arbitrator's power to decide on time frame for pleadings. Arbitrators have a power to terminate a reference if a party fails to file pleadings within the stipulated period of time. And just if you think that you can, if a party believes that he can induce a termination of a reference only to start all over again, the answer is no. my understanding of the law is that if there is a default and the arbitrator says that you are precluded from filing pleadings unless you get that decision set aside by a court either under 34, I don't think that a 37 would lie, but either under 34 or under 11 read with 15, that decision precludes you from urging the same claim before any other court or arbitral tribunal. So it operates as a res judicata in a manner of speaking. So those are the other provisions that I've touched upon. And I think that you could look at it, section 27, powers of an arbitrator for taking assistance of the court to summon witnesses for either production of documents or giving oral testimony, because those powers are not available with the tribunal, but the court can assist the tribunal. The court of jurisdiction would be the appropriate court to apply to. So my note goes into many more details, which I've stayed away from today's webinar. I think I've taken much more than my allotted time, but I had a prompt on my screen which says that I could continue beyond my scheduled time. So I think that this may be a good time to stop. And perhaps if the organizers think fit, maybe to take a couple of questions, or if we've run out of time, my email address is on my note, and I'm happy to respond to any questions by email as well.
Yes. Thank you so much, Saran sir. On behalf of myself, Neeraj Shah, Associate Advocate of the Law Chamber of Siddharth Moharka, and the Law Club, which is a Telegram group, and we thank you from the bottom of the heart and look forward to at least one lecture by you every month. Viewers,
thank you, Neeraj.
And viewers have any questions, then you may message on 93241-75774 or any in the group, lawyer groups on the Telegram, latest by 15 April 2020, so that the Saran sir or the Siddharth sir can give all the answers to you. Again, thank you for all the friends for the latest lecture, first lecture in this group by the Saran sir, and the fantastic upgradations of the lawyer knowledge. We hope to empower lawyers and serve the nations. Thank you so much for everyone, sir.
Thank you, Neeraj, and thank you, Siddharth.
Thank you, sir.